Exodus chapter 7. There's a brief outline in your bulletin. Well, it's not really all that brief, I suppose. It looks a bit wordy. I want to read a small section, starting in verse 8, chapter 7. I want to read down to verse 13 anyways. And then I want to give an introduction to our message this morning, kind of give you an idea what we're going to do with the 10 plagues. You know, if you thought I was going to walk through the 10 plagues one at a time, I'm just not going to do that. It doesn't make any sense. We're going to talk about gnats this morning. No, we're not. or whatever, you know, total darkness for 3 days. We're not going to do that. We're going to clump things together in, I think, a good way so that the whole thing makes better sense. But let's start in verse 8 of chapter 7. I'll read down to verse 13 anyway. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down the staff before Pharaoh and the servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Bring that thing up for me, Tony. Here you go. Our message today is a two-part one, entitled The Power of God, Part 1. We now come to the plagues that God brings upon Egypt. It runs all the way to chapter 12, verse 42. It should be noted that these plagues were imposed upon all the Egyptians. And the first 3 included the Israelites. They experienced the first 3 plagues. The water turned to blood, the frogs, and all that stuff, and the biting insects. And then God separated Israel from the rest of the Egyptians. And it's pointed out throughout the story that the Israelites did not experience boils on man and beast. They didn't experience total darkness. That must have been a strange situation, because Goshen is right in the middle of the rich delta area of the Nile River. So here's this little spot. Everything else is pitch black. In the middle of that is this totally good section where you can see. People will walk, you can step literally from light into darkness and back into it just for fun. Must have been a fascinating moment, and for Pharaoh to wonder why, how come all my cattle are dying and theirs are just fine? Etc. So it was a curious problem, but that was God speaking to Pharaoh. The story is retold numerous times in the Old Testament, and how it's told sometimes in lengthy sections in the Psalms, sometimes really short sections, but it is the most retold story in the Old Testament. It was a grand narrative that pointed to the ultimate story of how God would save his people from their sins. He saved them from the treachery and the slavery of Egypt. Now, he will eventually save them from the sins. But how does this story point to that? It points to it in the last plague. The Passover is instituted, and the firstborn all die. And we're going to dig into that story separately. But that story points forward in a significant way when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper during the Passover, and all that stuff started to change. So the story is laden with future meaning. Lots of stuff. As a matter of fact, Israel's calendar changed as a result of this story. When they came out of Egypt into the wilderness, they're a nation without a land. They're going to the land that God wants them to have, called the land of Canaan, but they're not there yet. As a matter of fact, they resisted and stayed in the wilderness for 40 years. Everybody over 20 died. They just didn't believe God. But they restarted their calendar, and they shifted the entire calendar to start during the month of Aviv, or Nisan, which is the month of Passover. The Passover starts. On the 10th day of Aviv, the Passover began, and that's the first month of the year on the Jewish calendar. So it radically shifted the nation of Israel from starting in October, like our October, to starting in the month of Aviv, because the Passover started their whole calendar year, their whole religious calendar year. And the calendars of ancient peoples had this very distinct religious quality to them. It was just the nature of things. What happened after the Passover in Israel's history is a thing called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So for the next 7 days, they had this big feast celebrating, as they did after they got out of Egypt. They had this big, huge feast after Pharaoh's armies destroyed in the Red Sea. So the whole thing is centered around this whole event right here. So every year, Israel started the year by reminding everybody, this is what happened to our ancestors centuries ago in Egypt. And so the thing was a huge celebration to start the calendar year. I want to separate the first 9 plagues from the final plague, which is intimately connected to Israel's long-term history and what's coming. 2 other general things before we begin. In the style of the typical Near Eastern writer, he doesn't say behind every plague that this did not affect Israel. But the story flows in that direction. I think there's, of the last 7, there's 5 statements that Israel was not affected by this. And there's 2 that are left out. Well, that's just the nature of Old Testament narrative, ancient narrative. They start a pattern, and it just carries through the whole story. That's the first thing I want you to know. And secondly, the narrative is crafted such that Aaron and Moses do things which are symbolic. God actually does the real stuff. They walk outside, raise their hand, and all of a sudden the hailstones stop. While they were getting pelted, they just symbolically did all kinds of things. They struck the river and it turned to blood. They did lots of symbolic things. They were not tricksters. They weren't unique secret art people. They were just doing what God told them to do. We'll consider that next week. The message would be too long if we consider Pharaoh's hard-heartedness and Moses' obedience. So we're going to just talk about Pharaoh's hard heart this morning. And then we'll get into Moses' obedience next week. There are 4 things in the text that I will divide by person and groups of people. So let's move forward just a little bit here. First of all, there's 2 contrasts that I want you to see. There's Pharaoh's hard-heartedness contrasted with Moses' obedience. And we're just going to talk about Pharaoh's heart today. That's how I started life. That's how everybody starts life. They are naturally hard-hearted towards the things of God, and He opens their heart and changes them. Okay? What Moses does is he's 80 years old, he's had a history with God, and he just says, okay, I'm just going to obey. I'm going to do exactly what you told me to do. And as you read through the story, and it's not really a big part of the text, Moses and Aaron just do what God tells them to do. I just read that a few minutes ago. Just walk in there, throw your rod down, see what happens. Okay. And they obey. There's something really casual about that in the text, but don't overlook that. Simple, prompt obedience is so godly. All right? And the second part of the thing is that Israel is blessed and Egypt's destroyed. How does God do that? How does He bless these people, this tiny little group of people in this nation of people that are destroyed? The contrast is dramatic, and the plagues just point that out in spades. It's just really unique part of the story. We'll talk about that next week. There's a precept in here I want you to see that's really important. We are either the slave of God and His will, or the slave of Satan and his will. Hold your finger in Exodus chapter 7, turn over to Romans chapter 9, pardon me, chapter 6. Romans chapter 6. Find verse 15. This is Paul talking about the same general topic. He gets into Pharaoh and all that stuff in chapter 9. Chapter 6, he says, "What then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law but under grace? By no means. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness." So there's only two choices, folks. Paul reiterates it. Well, I'm either a slave to sin, and the devil's going, "This is great. I'll work on you later. Go visit with people who need to be tempted." Or you're a slave of righteousness, and you just do what God wants you to do. So at any given moment in my life, those two options are right in front of me. The Spirit of God says, "Mark, don't you walk over there. You serve me. You do what's right. You make the best choice." That situation confronts me, not near as much as it used to, but it still confronts me. All right? I'm back in Exodus chapter 7. I want to talk about four categories in here that I think are really important. Four categories of God's sovereignty, all right, which kind of break itself down throughout the story. I think this is just one slide. No, it's destruction of snakes. And we just read that section. Must have been a curious thing, you know. Moses thinking, "Ooh, my rod's going to turn into a snake? That's going to be cool." It did. "Oh, check it out, Aaron. Isn't that awesome?" He did it again. What happened after that? Well, here comes Pharaoh. You guys with all your magic tricks and all that jazz. He brings the magicians in there. They throw their rods down. Guess what happens? Snakes. How did they do that? God says, "Not a problem." So did the stick that Moses had get thicker because it ate a bunch of snakes? I don't really know. It must have been a curious situation. And it does not affect Pharaoh one iota. He's not affected by that at all. I would have been like, "Whoa." I would have backed up and said, we need to reconsider what's going on here. He was completely hard-hearted toward it. It says in the text, "And Pharaoh hardened his heart." Oh, just like God said he would. The second one is destruction of property. So from 7:14 down to 10:29, God just destroys all kind of property. I mean, the Nile goes red. There's all kind of nonsense going on. It's crazy. Insects are eating on people. Hailstones are falling down. Cattle are dying. It's a bizarre mess. Then we come to destruction of life and the final plague. And people die. I would imagine that there was a few Jews who died. I'm not doing all that nonsense, putting blood on the doorpost of my house. Who knows? The story doesn't tell us. That life is destroyed. That's not the end. There's one more. And then Pharaoh sends his army into the Red Sea. And all the security of the nation, the entire army, out of here, done. Every last person gone. So there's this destruction that's going on. It goes from the small to the biggest problem of all. Let me just kind of break up the plagues, kind of in a part of my introduction here. The first three formal plagues, blood, frogs, and biting insects, are relatively short, but irritating, yet none of them cause death. They dug next to the Nile River looking for good, clean water. So it wasn't pervasive. Pots had blood in it. There's a huge discussion. It went on for like 20 pages in one of my commentaries about whether or not this was actually blood. You're kidding me. But people argue about that kind of nonsense all the time. That first plague tested everybody's patience. The magicians duplicated the first two on a small scale by trickery. But by the third, they were undone and they surrendered. They actually say, "This is the finger of God." None of these plagues affected Pharaoh long term. He hardened himself. In the next three plagues, swarming insects animal disease and sores on man and beast, were much more harmful, killing livestock. And Pharaoh, he holds up. I'm not giving in to these two clowns. What's going on to people? The final three plagues, hail, locusts, and darkness, were more severe, destroying animals and crops, and the darkness resulted in widespread panic in the entire country. Everybody's like panicking because there's no light. Total darkness. Pharaoh seemed to be open to discussion about the people going, but always has a caveat: you have to come back. He has to find a way to bring them back. He can't let them go permanently. In 1024. The story says God is sovereign over nature, animals, and mankind. He has all the power because he has all the authority. The 10th plague is what one commentator calls a quantum leap in severity. Not a single household was unaffected, unless you didn't have any children. And if you were the firstborn of your spouse, that person died. So there was this mass death across the country, which troubled everybody, including Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh's son was considered to be a god becoming incarnate. And he died too. It was a door opener for Israel to leave. Can you imagine? They're packing up their stuff, their carts and their animals and everything else, and they're leaving from Goshen, walking across this huge area where people grew things, and everything had been destroyed by hail. And 3 days of total darkness. Dead people everywhere. And they're packing things, and people are just throwing things on their cart. Take this silver and take this gold. Get out of our country. We don't want you in here anymore. It must have been a bedlam situation. And the Israelites said, no problem. I'll take all your stuff. Off we went. Walk out of the country. Therefore, this plague gets the most coverage in the story, and it explains the Passover and all that stuff. It should be noted that the Hebrews, who do not call these events, they don't call these events plagues. They actually, there's 3 different words in the text that are translated plagues in some translations. And the 3 words are really closer to God just struck them. He just nailed them. The word is probably better translated strikes. God strikes Egypt. He just punches them in the face. He just hits them wherever he wants to hit them. He just nails them. So strikes is probably a better word in terms of translations, but the plague hits everybody. So God didn't just, he punches Pharaoh at the end in the last 3 plagues, but everyone's getting nailed by something along the way. Nature, animals, and mankind. Everybody gets nailed. So we begin with the 2 main characters, Pharaoh and Moses. And at some level, this appears, at least in the storyline, if you don't believe in God, just a contest between the Pharaoh of Egypt and a mere man who used to be part of the court, who was 80 years old, named Moses, who becomes famous in folklore and everything else. Well, it's a much bigger story than that. Because Pharaoh is simply the instrument of Satan. And Moses is the instrument of God. Pharaoh's hard-heartedness is first identified in Exodus 4, verse 21. Look there. I'll read it to you. Verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. God told Moses that he would harden Pharaoh's heart. And there's the references right there where it says, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Okay? The second set of references, there's not more of them. It says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, or simply that his heart was hardened. In chapter 7, verses 8 through 13, Pharaoh's heart is still hardened in spite of the presentation of miracles. Let me just say this. In reality, people are never transformed by a miracle. when they observed miracles, Jesus performed hundreds of miracles on perhaps thousands of people. He fed 9,000 people in the course of like 3 weekends. Just suddenly from a little tiny bit of food. People were never transformed by a miracle. You need one inside your heart to be transformed. Watching something out there, whether it's hail from the sky or total darkness, insects everywhere, frogs bouncing around there, those things never change people. The story proves that. We are not transformed by something that we visually see. We're transformed by something that comes inside of us and takes our heart of stone out and gives us a heart of flesh to love God. That's how we change. So, the emotional part of this whole thing, and Pharaoh lost his firstborn son, and he turns around and sends his army to try to get those guys back. What kind of foolishness could that possibly be in that particular man's mind? So, this was a case of man against God in this particular part of the text right here. I put a little note on the side. Was this the devil creating snakes, or is this just magic? Of course, magic is sleight of hand in our world. There's people who can make entire trainings just disappear. I've seen a guy do it on TV. It's like, oh, that's pretty slick. It's just a trick. This is not the finger of God. This is not the power of Satan. This magic is just magic. It's human art forms. And that's what Pharaoh thought about the first snake that appeared when Moses threw his rod down. Oh, you guys are pretty good magicians. He knew what a magician was. Somebody who could do a trick in front of somebody else, sleight of hand, or whatever else. When they do them on America's Got Talent, all that jazz, guess what? They're just tricks. They are explainable. When God does something, there is no explanation. There's a huge difference right here. So this looks like a case of Satan versus God. No. This is man against God in the opening scene. And God says, give me those snakes, I'll eat them all. And he just destroys all the snakes on the ground. Must have been a scene to remember for a long time. There's no magic. It's just human magic in here. Something that comes from this for me, the first 3 plagues or strikes went from something out of the ordinary, which was, and here's what the big discussion was about the first plague of blood. Lots of commentators said, there was times in Egypt's history when the Nile did turn reddish. When you see blood, it's pretty red. It's deep, deep red. And people would say, in passing, oh, the Nile's red this year. Because soil would transform the color of it, so forth. So some commentators are like trying to, the whole thing didn't turn, it's turned reddish. So let's just say it's out of the ordinary. The first plague, God knew all that stuff, even if that's the case. And I don't necessarily believe it's the case. I think it turned to blood, period. We can't drink. This is going to poison us. 2, this is definitely the finger of God. So the first 3 plagues were designed to tell everybody, Israel and the Egyptians, whatever you think about those, the first sign, the frogs, that must have been overwhelming. If you don't like reptiles, that must have been the worst day of your life. Millions of frogs everywhere. And then they piled them up and there are all these heaps of frogs throughout the land. The stench of it, says in the text, was overwhelming. And the third plague. And at the end of the third plague, the magicians who worked for Pharaoh said, this is the finger of God. Okay, I got your minds turned around here. So now you know who's running the show. There's a progressive sense as the plagues move on. They went from something that may have been seen before to something that was definitely, as I said, the finger of God. The 4th, 5th, and 6th plague, let's move on to that one. Strikes, or plagues or strikes, ruin the land. It says in 8:24, I'll turn over and read it to you. 8 verse 24 says, I'll start verse 22. But on that day I set apart the land of Goshen where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Think about that. Here's Goshen is a section of land in the delta. And so there's this invisible line in the space, and on this side there's flies everywhere. Over here it's not a single fly. It's like there's this magical wall around God's people that protects those flies and tells the flies, you can't come here. How does somebody pull off that little stunt? Suppose they had a nice square line. It was jagged everywhere. There's an Israel house, no flies over there. It must have been a curious situation for people to wrap their heads around. You see the power of God here? The rest of that verse. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people tomorrow. This sign shall happen. And the Lord did so. There were great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses throughout all the land of Egypt. The land was ruined by the swarms of flies. The hardness is of Satan. Let me jump to the 7th, 8th, and 9th strikes are directed at Pharaoh and the Egyptians so that they know that there is none like God in all the earth. Let me back that up, Tony. Somehow we missed that. There it is right there. The last 3 plagues of the trip of the 9 actually are directed at Pharaoh. And he was, we back up just a moment. There are some people who think that the 10 plagues specifically spoke against the gods of Egypt. That's a pretty hard thing to prove. God is simply demonstrating his power. In some cases, you have a God for this or a God for that. That's a bunch of nonsense. And he just presented plagues that proved all that stuff wrong. And Pharaoh was a god in Egypt. And he said, your son's going to die just like everybody else's. So, a hard heart thinks that God can be negotiated with. And throughout the story of the plagues, Pharaoh keeps negotiating. At some point he says, okay, let's negotiate. All the men can go, but nobody else. Oh, we have to take all our families. You can go, but don't bring any animals. You can go, but you have to come back quick. You can't be gone long. How about if you sacrifice right here in Egypt? And all Moses says to him, that's not obeying God. We have to obey God. We'll get to that next week. Moses keeps obeying God, just whatever God tells him to do, he does. And he tells Pharaoh, we're not going to not obey God. It's a critical piece of the story right here. I take away from that, and I'll repeat it next week. If you follow Pharaoh and Satan, you will end up with what Pharaoh and Satan have for you. If you obey God and follow him, you will end up with what God has for you. And the two are not even close to each other. But we try to mix those things together. I want to do what I want to do, and I can get what God has for me, even though I do what I want to do. And God says, that doesn't work that way. The 8th strike is all about God's power over nature and Israel's future. God tells Moses that this strike will be part of the story for generations. Look in chapter 10, verse 2. This is the plague of locusts. And it's as if God got all the locusts in the entire universe, in the world, and put them on the edge of Egypt, and then it blew them all in down. So the country is completely destroyed. There's not a single green thing left. You like locusts? You don't want them to jump on your shoulder, hide in your hair, and all that jazz? Ooh, it must have been just makes me shiver to think about it. All that nonsense. And listen, look at chapter 10, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants. That's the first time it says that in the text, by the way. He hardened Pharaoh's heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. At the removal of the locust, God directs Moses to stretch out his hands towards heaven, and darkness settles in for 3 days. The curious thing about this was that there was light where the people of God lived, 10 verse 24. And then Pharaoh tries to negotiate one more time, and he tells him to get out. Moses protested, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is the final encounter between Moses and Pharaoh. He tells him to never see him again under threat of death. Hard-heartedness is always of Satan. That's an important precept. I've been hard-hearted about lots of things in my life. So it hits me like a ton of bricks. Hard-heartedness is of Satan. It is born inside someone who has a secret sense of rebellion. I'm just not doing that. You're not making me do that. There's just this fighting against what's going on. Primarily authority. Primarily authority. Years ago when I was at city council, I was on a ride along and I was talking to a police officer. He came to our church. And I said, you know, what's the most common thing you stop people for? Or arrest people for? His answer was kind of caught me off guard. Contempt of God. What is that? Contempt of God. Instantly, as soon as I asked the question, he said those words. I go, explain that to me. He said, you know, when you stop people, they either have one of three attitudes. They're neutral towards you, kind of indifferent. They're totally submissive and are, oh, I'm so sorry, or they're contemptuous. If you are contemptuous, we are going to find a way to arrest you. Oh, well, I'm never going to be contemptuous toward a cop. What's he saying? There are people who are naturally contemptuous towards anybody who's in authority. If you're wearing a uniform, you're probably in authority somewhere. If I walk into a basketball court and I'm wearing black and white, guess what? I'm the person in authority. I can shut this game down right now. Do not get in my face. Act contemptuous towards me. I don't think those words, but I sometimes wonder if I should. I mean, there's situations in life where people are out there just in someone else's face. My sister teaches in a public school, and she says, Mark, contempt is everywhere in this grade school. These children scream profanities in people's faces all the time, and no one can do anything about it. So I fear for our culture. This contempt right here is just, this hard-heartedness, this contempt for God's authority by Pharaoh is just blatant. Okay? Let me read a couple verses to you. Psalm 95, verse 8. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. The psalmist writes, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Do not harden your heart. As at Meribah, and on the day of Massah in the wilderness. This is God warning Israel to not harden their hearts towards him as they did in the wilderness. The Old Testament is a history of hardened hearts. Over and over and over. You say, how can Israel be the recipient of the patriarchs and the covenants and the law and the rescue from Egypt and all that stuff? King David, how could they be the recipients of all that stuff and still be warned by God not to harden their heart? Now that same exact text is quoted in the book of Hebrews, chapter 3. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. As it is said today, if you hear my voice, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. Again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying to David so long ago afterwards, in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Israel is an Old Testament entity, and the Spirit of God was not in their hearts. We are a New Testament entity, and the warning goes out to us today. Do not harden your hearts. Satan's object in my life is to harden my heart towards loving God, loving the church, loving the people of God, loving my family, loving what's right. He wants to harden my heart towards that, and he creates circumstances which give me reason to be hard-hearted. Pharaoh's hard-heartedness is a huge part of the story. It is always, always of Satan. Here's the question. If you're going to appeal to the person who's in authority over you, what's the best attitude? Humility. If you are hard-hearted towards a person in authority, she is going to shut you down. Totally. Moses is almost blank-faced right here. He doesn't have any opinion about what's going on with Pharaoh. He's not really responding to Moses. He's responding to who Moses represents. God's authority. It troubles a lot of people. They just will not submit to God's authority. So I want to draw three conclusions. I think I have 3, yeah? And then we'll be done. The Old Testament presents us with 3 iniquitous patterns. Rebellion, pride, and selfishness. And those things are at the core of who we are as human beings. I've said this to numerous people over the years in discipleship settings. We all major in one, and we minor in the other 2. We all kind of begin life in one of those places. We are arrogant, prideful, everything else. We are selfish beyond belief, or we're just plain old rebellious. We were having dinner Friday night with some friends of ours, and they have 2 boys who are like 15 years apart from each other, so the one boy's already out of the house. And I was mentioning this general topic, and Dad said, that's our son. He's rebellious beyond belief. He just hates everybody in authority and pushes against anything that someone else would do. He would be in jail for contempt of cop every day if he could get stopped. He just hates people in authority. Okay, that's easy. What do you do about a person who's quiet and easygoing, whatever else they do? One of those 3 things are seriously part of our lives. The devil has taken close notes on Mark's life. He knows exactly which one it is, and he works that thing over every day. God hates them all, and Satan uses each of them for our demise. God overcomes all those iniquities by me surrendering. It's not about me, which addresses selfishness and pride, and I will submit to the person in authority. And Pharaoh's going, I'm not submitting to anybody. I'll kill everybody in this country if I have to, and still be standing. And he just doesn't give up. Okay? That's a precept that the Old Testament just speaks volumes to me about. Someday maybe I'll do a mini-series on those 3 things. The second conclusion, Exodus 9 verse 30, is the first time in the Old Testament where the term fear the Lord occurs. And I think the context in which this appears is really important. What is the fear of the Lord? And my definition is that it's an awe and reverence that causes us to surrender to the sovereignty of God. When Jesus came to my heart, that happened to me. It's a fear and an awe and a reverence for who God is. He is absolutely in charge. I am not. Don't ask me to be in charge. God's in charge. And I think that's what fear of the Lord is, the beginning of wisdom. When I see that, and we're reading about stuff like that in the book of Proverbs, it's just everywhere. Fear of the Lord is reverence and awe that causes us to surrender to the sovereignty of God. Does a part of your life feel like it's out of control? God's saying, surrender to the sovereignty of God. Let me ask you a question. Is God sovereign in my life, in your life, in the church, in our church's life? Oh, yeah. Is God sovereign in the life of a backslidden Christian who hasn't been to church 6 months? God sovereign in the life of a pagan who was drunk last night and is overcoming stupor this morning? Is God sovereign in the life of Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel? Is God sovereign in the life of an imam? Is God sovereign in the life of 19 people who blew up the Trade Center? Was God sovereign in the life of Job? His four friends said, "You screwed up, man. You deserve all this." That wasn't true. I think life tests me to see if I truly believe that God's sovereign in life. It just, things happen. When my daughter was sexually assaulted by her music teacher, God just stepped off the throne for a moment. God's sovereign. I mean, I was reading some of this past week. Yeah, God was saying, "Mark, are you going to get this? Will you eventually recognize that I was sovereign at that particular moment?" Grief. Is God sovereign in the midst of my worst grief? He is. One last thing. If we don't surrender to the Lord in all things, we do not yet fear the Lord. I think I actually have 4 of them, don't I? One more? So I think of this surrender thing as people have said, I've said to many people, is so-and-so a believer? Well, that's really not the right question. Because many people are believers, they've stepped into the family of faith, but their mind is very carnal, it's very worldly, it's very driven and controlled by what's going on in the world and everything else. They don't really sense the power of God yet. They don't really submit to it. So I prefer to ask the question, is that person becoming a believer? Are they walking in the direction of Jesus in every corner and aspect of their life? And how they think, and how they use their money, and how they use their time, and what they value the most? Or is this person still a carnal, worldly, off-the-edge person who's way over there in the wrong spot, and way over here in the right spot? I have relatives who I love dearly, but they have little corners of life way over there in the world. They won't listen to a single thing from the Word of God on that topic. But what's going on? But they're committed to the local church in numerous ways. So they have this piece of their life that's just carnal and wicked. You know what? We don't fear the Lord unless we fear God in all things in our life. Everything's got to be part of what God wants. And maybe for today's message, is there a part of my life that's not surrendered to Christ, that He doesn't really control? Give me something as hard to put your finger on as how I think about stuff. Do I think the way God thinks about stuff? Or do I have my own mindset about stuff? Do I have ungodly thinking patterns? Everything about Pharaoh was ungodly. Everything. He was just stupid. It took Moses a long time to get his thinking wrapped around the right direction. One last thing. The plagues and strikes of God are evidence that God holds individuals and peoples accountable. And in the midst of that accountability, innocent people can be injured. Do you imagine that some of the Egyptians thought, why am I experiencing all this crazy nonsense stuff? Pharaoh's is making bad decisions. Or do you think there were Israelites in the midst of the camp who just didn't obey. It's just, God is dealing with individuals, Pharaoh and Moses. He's dealing with Israel and Egypt. And people get hurt. I extract from that who I associate, what really matters. In the story, whoever associated with Pharaoh, oh my goodness, did they get mashed. Whoever associated with Moses, they were blessed. We'll talk about that next week. Let's pray. Father, we come to the throne of grace today. And I stand amazed at the power of God. Your power. It is amazing how you control and you are part of so much that's going on in our world. Help us to see how sovereign you are. There's not a thing going on right now in our lives, personal lives, or in our corporate life as a church, or in the city of Huntsville, or the state of Alabama, or the country, this country, or around the world, that's not within your care, purview. You know everything. And the world's full of rebellious people who resist your authority. And we pray that you will bring it to yourself. If one of them's in our place here today, I pray that you'll bend their will, open their heart, and take out their heart of stone, their heart of stone, and replace it with heart of flesh, that's soft and submissive to the will of God. Thank you, Lord, that you are a holy God, and we have nothing to fear for what you've got planned for us. We look forward to it. Bless your words and impress them upon